Welcome to iLectureOnline, and now we're going to do a new series on probability and statistics. The first thing we need to do is go over a bunch of definitions, because statistics has a lot to do with how we name, how we call certain things. And so let's start out with some very simple ones. First of all, what do we mean by probability? The probability is the chance of a certain outcome or a certain event to occur. If the probability is high, then it's very likely that event or that outcome will occur. If the probability is low, then it's not very likely that it will occur. So, for some examples, let's say that we toss a die. What is the chance that we'll get a 1? What is the probability that we'll get a 1? That's what we mean by what is the likely or unlikely outcome. What if we flip a coin? What is the likelihood that we get heads, or what is the likelihood that we get tails? What is the probability? And also, for example, when we draw a card, these are very simple examples, but they kind of do the trick in making us understand what probability means. So we also have to understand that there's really 3 different kinds of probabilities. Most of the time we think about the first type, which is what we call the theoretical probability. Based upon certain laws, for example, a die only has 6 sides. That means that when you toss a die, the probability that you'll get one of the 6 sides is 1 out of 6. That is just straightforward. We can understand that. But sometimes we have different kinds of probabilities as well. Sometimes we have what we call empirical probabilities. Those are based upon discovery, on gathering data, gathering scientific information, and then based upon that information, we can make a pretty good assessment of what the probability is that some other event or some other outcome will occur. For example, if we live in a place where we have measured that there's a lot of earthquakes, the probability of the next earthquake happening must be pretty high. For example, if on the last 100 years we had a good strong earthquake every 5 years or so, then the probability that another one will occur in the next 10 years is pretty high. But if we live in a place where we haven't had an earthquake for 100 years, then the probability that an earthquake will occur over the next 10 years or so will be pretty low. So it's based upon gathering information about a certain event or a certain outcome. For example, insurance companies use a lot of information about the demographics of a population as to how likely it is that someone will get into a car accident. A young driver starting out with not a lot of experience, they're more likely to get into a car accident. A person who's been driving for a while, has a very good record, is less likely to get into a car accident. So again, they deal with probabilities in those sense. So we have theoretical probabilities, which is basically, when we have a 6-sided die, or we pull a card out of a deck, we pretty well know what the probability is that we'll get a certain card. Empirical probability is based on historical data, geological records, things like that. And then we have what we call subjective probability. That is based more on experience and intuition. So we may not be keeping track of any particular event or any particular outcome, but based upon experiences, based upon what we have experienced in the past, we can come up with some pretty good idea of what the probability is that something else will happen. For example, I would say that the probability of getting hurt when falling off a bicycle is pretty high. I may have never fallen off a bicycle, but I can imagine when you're riding 10, 20 miles an hour and you fall off a bicycle, you're very likely going to get hurt. So that's intuition. I may not have experienced it, I may not have any data on it, but I can tell you with a pretty high confidence that there's a high probability that you will get hurt. So that's based on intuition and experience. So here are the 3 different kinds of probabilities. Most of the time we'll be working with this type of probability, the theoretical probability, but we'll delve into these 2 probabilities a little bit as well. So now we're going to continue with these videos, and we'll give you some more information about specific definitions that you have to understand before we go on and start doing some real exercises. So if you like this, stay tuned and watch the next video.